Tokyo, late 1930s. Inside a polished naval conference hall, the air smells of ink, cigarettes, and quiet confidence. Japan's admirals stand around polished tables lined with the silhouettes of their prized battleships, towering steel fortresses that project raw dominance across the Pacific. The mighty Yamato class, still on the drawing board, gleams in concept. 18-inch guns, armor like a fortress, speed to outrun any challenger. Nearby, a smaller model sits almost unnoticed. A flat deck, thin hull, barely armored. A ship without guns. A U.S. aircraft carrier. Some officers snicker. One taps the model with a pen, amused. These American floating airstrips. Just one good hit from our big guns, and they sink like toys. Laughter rolls through the room. Confident, certain. Aircraft carriers are viewed as auxiliaries used for scouting ahead of battleships, nothing more. Power, they believe, still comes from the main battery and the broadside. No one imagines that within just a few years, those floating airstrips would decide the fate of empires and seal the ocean roads Japan once believed it owned. Because as the Pacific War erupts, Japan will soon discover that the seas have changed. And what comes next will reshape naval warfare forever. At the dawn of the 20th century, the world's oceans were still ruled by the giants of steel battleships. Their towering guns and thick armor represented prestige, national power, and the ability to decide wars. Naval strategy across the globe followed the same doctrine. Whoever concentrated the most heavily armored capital ships controlled the sea. Japan, newly risen among the great powers, embraced this philosophy with religious conviction. The ghost of Tsushima still haunted and inspired them. In 1905, the Imperial Japanese Navy shattered the Russian Baltic Fleet in one decisive battle. That moment etched a belief deep into Japan's naval soul. Victory would always come from a single climactic duel between battleships. In the 1920s, treaties attempted to prevent another naval arms race. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 limited battleship construction, but quietly opened a loophole. Certain ships could be converted into aircraft carriers. The United States transformed the unfinished USS Lexington and USS Saratoga, experimenting with the new idea of air power at sea. Japan followed suit, creating Akagi and Kaga, reshaping battlecruiser hulls into something entirely different, flat decks where wings replaced cannons. Despite this innovation, carriers remained experimental. Pilots called their decks dancing floors due to the swaying motion at sea. Admirals saw them as merely scouts, eyes for the real weapons, battleships. Aviation advocates were few, and skepticism was universal. Japan's naval leadership still poured most of its political strength, industrial capacity, and pride into battleship superiority. Designs grew more ambitious with each year. The Yamato class, secretly planned to outgun any American enemy, symbolized the national obsession. Engineers sharpened the cutting edge of armor and artillery, convinced that brute force would dominate the Pacific. Meanwhile, the United States was adopting a slower but steadier approach. American naval planners saw carriers as tools for flexibility, ships that could project power far beyond the horizon. They experimented with deck parks, moving aircraft quickly for launch. They developed folding wings, catapults, and arresting wires to increase functionality. Their doctrine wasn't yet perfect. Mistakes and accidents were common, but they were learning. By the late 1930s, both nations possessed small but experienced naval air arms. Yet their visions for the future remained worlds apart. Japan viewed its carriers as elite weapons to strike first, soften the enemy, and prepare the stage for the battleships to deliver the killing blow. The U.S. Navy, constrained by limited budgets and political hesitation, quietly nurtured the concept of a carrier strike force that might one day stand at the forefront rather than behind. Rising tensions in Asia made these differing doctrines critical. Japan's expanding empire, Manchuria in 1931, all-out war in China by 1937, brought them into direct confrontation with American interests. Oil and resources drove Japan's decisions. The Pacific, rich with the lifelines of a modern empire, became a chessboard. The U.S. responded with embargoes and warnings. Every year, the horizon darkened a little more. Both navies prepared for a conflict that felt increasingly inevitable. Yet even here, their predictions diverged. Japan envisioned a short, devastating war. A surprise strike crippling American naval power, forcing negotiation before America's industry could awaken. A war of bold gambles and surgical victories. A war where elite training and superior early doctrine would secure dominance. The United States, evaluating cold numbers, shipyard outputs, fuel reserves, pilot training capacity, envisioned something else entirely. A long war of attrition that Japan could never withstand. Two paths, two visions, one ocean. Aircraft carriers, dismissed by many as fragile outliers, were quietly gaining abilities neither side fully grasped. Range, speed, the power to unleash destruction hundreds of miles away from the enemy's guns. Soon, the world would see the first glimpses of what naval aviation could truly achieve. And Japan, confident in its mastery, would be the first to demonstrate it. Japan would be the first nation to reveal the terrifying potential of carrier power. At the center of this transformation stood Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a strategist who understood the United States more clearly than almost anyone in Tokyo. He had studied in America, seen its factories, watched its cars roll off assembly lines by the thousands. Yamamoto knew a prolonged war would be fatal. If conflict erupted, Japan needed overwhelming success quickly. Carriers gave him that possibility. Throughout the 1930s, Japanese naval aviation evolved at a pace unmatched globally. Japan trained pilots relentlessly, cultivating a corps of airmen with exceptional skill. Their doctrine emphasized precision strikes, coordinated attacks, and the belief that a carrier's air wing could replace a battleship's guns. Everything Japan invested into its naval air power came together in December 1941. 6 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, sailed silently across the northern Pacific. Their decks held hundreds of aircraft prepared to deliver the defining moment of Japan's war plan. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed naval warfare forever. Battleships, lined up peacefully inside the harbor, were hammered from above, burning, capsizing, sinking in minutes. The weapon that once symbolized dominance lay shattered under the surface. In a single morning, the age of the battleship was struck a fatal blow. Japan didn't stop there. Carrier task forces swept across the Pacific with frightening precision. From the Philippines to Malaya, from Rabaul to the Dutch East Indies, Allied positions collapsed. In early 1942, Japanese carriers struck deep into the Indian Ocean, sinking HMS Hermes and humiliating the British Eastern Fleet, which fled for survival. For a brief and blazing moment, the Empire of Japan mastered the carrier revolution. Yet beneath this triumph lay a dangerous imbalance. Japan could build carriers, but not enough. They could train elite aircrews, but not replace them. They could strike boldly, but not sustain a long war. The United States followed a different trajectory. As Japan expanded, American shipyards roared to life. The U.S. Navy launched new carriers one after another, Yorktown class, then the larger and more efficient Essex class. Meanwhile, a robust training pipeline ensured fresh pilots filled every deck. Japan's naval construction relied on craftsmanship, precise but slow. The U.S. relied on mass production, rapid and overwhelming. The clock was ticking, and Japan's early success was its own enemy. It convinced many leaders that the war could be won before American numbers mattered. Confidence hardened into complacency. Some officers continued to believe carriers were vulnerable tools, meant only to support the real deciding battle between battleships. The giant Yamato sailed as the embodiment of that belief, a monument to an era already fading. Yet war has a brutal way of revealing the truth. In May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea offered a glimpse of the new reality. 2 fleets engaged without ever seeing each other, a conflict fought entirely by aircraft beyond the horizon. No battleship fired a decisive shot. The era of the gun duel was ending. Japan's leadership didn't fully recognize what was changing. Their pilots, though deadly, were irreplaceable. Their carriers, while powerful, could not be easily rebuilt. Their strategy depended on victory, without understanding what defeat would cost. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine who truly ruled the Pacific skies. The next major battle would not only test carriers, it would expose whether Japan's early success was the birth of supremacy, or merely the last advantage they would ever hold. Across the ocean, American carriers quietly prepared for their moment. Intelligence breakthroughs, new tactics, hardened resolve. Two carrier forces were on a collision course. And soon, the world would learn who really controlled the Pacific. Naval warfare isn't only shaped by steel, it is shaped by ideas. Japan and the United States both possessed carriers. Both trained aviators. Both understood air power had potential. But their minds were anchored in different eras. Japan's doctrine still worshipped the decisive surface battle, a modern replay of Tsushima. Carriers were tools to enable that battle. Strike first, cripple the enemy's fleet, and then let battleships deliver the ultimate blow. Every operation was designed around this concept. The U.S. Navy approached the problem differently. Control of the air meant control of the sea. Recognizing they might lose battleships early in a conflict, U.S. planners invested in carrier groups that could roam independently, striking targets far beyond the enemy's reach. Their logistics, fuel tankers, repair ships, escort vessels, formed a mobile ecosystem that let carriers operate across vast distances. Japan focused on perfection. America focused on endurance. The war would test which vision could survive reality. Carriers are nothing without the aircraft that give them reach, and here again the contrast was stark. Japan prioritized performance above all. Their legendary Mitsubishi S6M0 embodied this philosophy. Long range, incredible maneuverability, lethal in dogfights. But to achieve that performance, it sacrificed armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. Japanese bombers and torpedo planes delivered destructive punches but were also fragile when hit. Early in the war, these aircraft dominated Allied skies. Pilots described the Zero as something supernatural. A fighter that could turn tighter, climb faster, and strike with precision. Meanwhile, the U.S. fielded more rugged, survivable aircraft. F for F Wildcat. Slower, but tough enough to return home riddled with bullets. SBD Dauntless. Dive bomber with exceptional accuracy, soon to become legendary. TBD Devastator. Outdated torpedo bomber, brave but vulnerable. American designs would rapidly improve. New fighters like the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair would tilt the air war decisively. But at the start, Japan's aircraft superiority shaped every engagement. A deadly advantage that would cut deeply into the U.S. Pacific Fleet. However, technology does not stand still in wartime. The race was on, and innovation would become a battlefield of its own. Perhaps the greatest disparity between the two navies came not from steel or engines, but from the people in the cockpits. Japan crafted elite aviators through years of rigorous instruction. Only the most gifted survived the training pipeline. By 1941, they fielded a small corps of masters, pilots who had already gained combat experience in China. Their teamwork was unmatched, their skill terrifying. But this system contained a fatal flaw, could not expand. Producing a single Japanese carrier pilot took too long. Too much expertise. Too much irreplaceable experience. Every loss cut into a reserve Japan could not replenish. The United States designed a different approach. They built a training system that might not produce as many natural aces, but produced aviators by the thousands. Standardization replaced exclusivity. Survival rates improved. Lessons learned were shared systematically, fast. A pilot graduating in 1944 benefited from every mistake made in 1942. Japan's pilots soared at the start of the war. But attrition is a predator that hunts excellence first. When experienced Japanese aviators fell into the sea, their replacements were fewer, younger, less trained, and the gap widened month by month. This, more than any single weapon or tactic, threatened Japan's future on the ocean. For soon, they would face a United States growing stronger each day, while their own strength evaporated with every dogfight. Japan's early dominance was built on brilliance, but brilliance alone could not withstand endless war. The next set of angles revealed deeper shifts still unfolding beneath the waves. War is not only fought with guns and steel, it is fought with information. Japan entered the conflict believing surprise and secrecy would preserve their advantage. They assumed coded communications were secure, and that American intelligence capabilities were limited. But deep inside a cramped room at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, U.S. cryptanalysts quietly worked to unlock Japan's naval language. Led by Commander Joseph Rockefort, these experts, some mathematicians, some linguists, cracked messages piece by piece. Their greatest breakthrough came when they identified AF as Midway Atoll. A simple ruse involving a fake water shortage message confirmed it. Suddenly, the U.S. Navy knew where and when Japan intended to strike next. Japan never achieved a similar breakthrough. Their intelligence system underestimated cryptanalysis and failed to identify American strategic intent clearly. Blindness became a silent enemy. As battle plans unfolded and fleets maneuvered across thousands of miles, invisible mathematicians helped decide the destiny of ships and crews. Knowledge, not armor, would determine who walked into the ambush. A navy's power is not just what sails into battle. It's what can be repaired and replaced afterward. Japan entered the war with a well-trained fleet but limited support. Battleships and carriers relied on distant shipyards. Damage that might take the U.S. weeks to repair could take Japan months, if the ship could even return home. The United States constructed floating repair bases, mobile dry docks. Fleets were patched and rearmed closer to the front, returning ships to battle with a speed Japan could scarcely comprehend. Production differences were even more devastating. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States built over 100 aircraft carriers, including escort carriers. Japan built around a dozen fleet carriers. U.S. factories produced over 100,000 aircraft. Japan built roughly a quarter of that number. Industrial force became military force. Quantity gained a new, relentless quality. Even when Japan won tactical victories early in the war, they could not afford the losses required to achieve them. Their empire was racing against a clock only one side controlled. War is more than battles, it is lives consumed. Japanese naval aviators entered the war with pride and a sense of destiny. They had trained together for years, bonded as close as brothers. When they climbed into cockpits, they carried not only weapons but the hopes of an empire. Yet the Pacific is vast. When an aircraft fell into the sea, rescue was rare. The ocean swallowed pilots silently, dragging years of experience beneath the waves. Losses in 1942 were manageable. Losses in 1943 became bleeding wounds. By 1944, Japan faced a crisis from which it would never recover. New pilots, sometimes rushed through training, entered battles against American aviators who had survived countless engagements. The imbalance grew into brutality. Every Japanese carrier sunk cost not just a ship, but the irreplaceable human core that gave it offensive power. It would take years to produce a competent pilot. The U.S. could produce one every few weeks. Japan's courage was unquestionable, their devotion absolute. But courage without reinforcement becomes sacrifice, and devotion without sustainability becomes tragedy. Each of these angles, strategy, technology, intelligence, logistics, human endurance, formed a tide that began to turn against Japan's early supremacy. Soon, all these forces would converge at a small atoll in the Central Pacific. A battle where Japan sought to finish what Pearl Harbor had begun. A battle where the United States sought to seize control of the Pacific's future. Only one side understood the new nature of naval warfare. The moment of truth was approaching. The Battle of Midway, June 1942. Summer sunlight shimmers across the Pacific as Japan's most powerful carrier force steams toward its objective. Their mission is to crush the U.S. Pacific Fleet's remaining carriers and seize Midway Atoll, turning it into a forward stronghold. Success would secure Japan's defensive perimeter, forcing America into negotiations. On the surface, the plan appears unstoppable. For veteran carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, the same force that struck Pearl Harbor. Hundreds of aircrews trained to perfection. Battleships and cruisers ready to fire if needed. But Japan enters the battle under a deadly illusion. They believe only one American carrier remains operational. In reality, 3 are waiting. Thanks to code-breaking, Admiral Chester Nimitz positions USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and the hastily repaired USS Yorktown northeast of Midway, unseen, ready to strike. The opening moves unfold in chaos and pressure. Before dawn, Japanese aircraft roar off carrier decks, diving through clouds to hammer Midway's defenses. Flames rise from fuel dumps and runways. The atoll's defenders scramble to survive. But the first American response is already airborne, lumbering torpedo planes and outnumbered fighters launching with desperate courage. Many do not return. Their formations shatter under the guns of Zero fighters. Dozens of young aviators vanish into the sea. Their deaths seem tragically futile. Yet these sacrifices are not in vain. They pull Japan's combat air patrol down to low altitude. They force the carriers to maneuver violently. They disrupt the carefully timed Japanese rearming operation below deck. Torpedoes unloaded, bombs reloaded to strike the newly discovered American carriers. Then, fate enters. U.S. dive bombers SBD Dauntless arrive at the perfect moment, almost by accident. They spot the Japanese carriers just as their decks are cluttered with fueled aircraft and ordnance. At 10:22 a.m., the sky splits open. From high altitude, the Dauntless plunge like spears of steel. Pilots push their aircraft into near-vertical dives, wind screaming against their canopies. Bombs detach one by one. A heartbeat later, Fire Akagi erupts. Fire Kaga is engulfed. Fire Soryu becomes an inferno. In less than 5 minutes, 3 cornerstone carriers of the Imperial Navy are turned into burning wrecks. Shock ripples across the Japanese fleet. Commanders who once believed in invincibility now stare at a nightmare. But the battle is not over. Hiryu, the last surviving carrier, strikes back with fierce resolve, launching waves that cripple Yorktown. Smoke pours from the American deck. Sailors fight fire and flooding. Their ship appears doomed. Yet the U.S. still has 2 operational carriers and a clear target. In the afternoon, Dauntless return. Hiryu suffers the same fate as her sisters, fire consuming everything. By sunset, Japan's greatest naval air strike force, the pride of the empire, is gone. For carriers lost, dozens of irreplaceable pilots gone. Years of training extinguished in a single day. As darkness falls, Admiral Yamamoto recognizes the truth. The initiative in the Pacific has shifted, not gradually but violently. Midway is more than a battle. It is the collision of 2 eras, the death of battleship supremacy, the rise of air power as the dominant force of war at sea. Yet this was only the beginning. For while the wrecks of Akagi and Kaga sank into the deep, American carriers were multiplying. New ships, new pilots, new strategies. The U.S. Navy was evolving into a machine of aggression, fast, flexible, unstoppable. Japan, once the master of naval aviation, now stood on defense, wounded and dwindling. The war's turning point had arrived. And soon, the carrier war would intensify on a scale never imagined. The rise of American carrier supremacy. Midway marked the pivot, but the transformation of the Pacific did not happen overnight. The U.S. Navy still faced a long, brutal fight across island chains fortified by Japan's most determined defenders. And carriers would lead every mile of the advance. By late 1942, U.S. industrial power surged into the Pacific like a second fleet. New Essex-class carriers emerged, larger, more efficient, with advanced radar and larger air wings. Escort carriers added constant air cover to convoys and amphibious landings. Japanese pilots began encountering not 1 or 2 American carriers, but task groups operating in powerful formations. At Guadalcanal, Japan tried desperately to recover the initiative. Battles raged for months in the skies above and waters surrounding the island. Losses mounted on both sides, but Japan lost more pilots than aircraft, draining the precious core of its naval aviation. Each Japanese victory cost them strength they could not rebuild. Each American setback resulted in a damaged ship repaired and a new ship built. Through 1943, the carrier groups grew stronger still, pushing westward through the Solomon Islands, then into the Gilberts and Marshalls. U.S. naval aviation perfected fast carrier task force operations, Coordinated flight cycles, radar-directed fighters, and overwhelming air patrols kept fleets safe from surprise. Meanwhile, Japan's hopes narrowed. Even the legendary Yamato and Musashi, symbols of battleship supremacy, lacked aircraft to protect them. They were mighty, but increasingly irrelevant. Without air cover, their guns could not influence the battles that mattered most. In June 1944, the final test of carrier supremacy struck in the Philippine Sea, the clash known forever as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft launched to defend Saipan and repel the American advance. Their pilots were younger, less trained, often flying outdated or poorly maintained aircraft. Radar vectors guided American fighters into perfect intercept positions. The result was catastrophic. Waves of Japanese planes fell in flames, around 300 destroyed in a single day. Japan's naval air arm, once the pride of the empire, was effectively annihilated. U.S. carriers pressed forward relentlessly, now dictating where and when battles occurred. The sky belonged to American aviators, and the sea followed. By late 1944, American carrier aircraft struck deep into the Philippines, sinking or crippling what was left of Japan's fleet. The Battle of Leyte Gulf attempted one final decisive blow, but lacking trained aviators, Japan's carriers were used as decoys, empty decks meant to lure away American forces. A symbol of total reversal. Carriers once valued as Japan's sharpest sword now existed merely as bait, hollow shadows of their former power. As U.S. fleets advanced closer to Japan itself, the empire turned to darker tactics. The skies filled with aircraft no longer meant to return. Kamikaze attacks began. Young pilots, untrained and desperate, were instructed to strike American ships with their own lives as weapons. At Okinawa, carriers endured some of the heaviest blows. Decks aflame, aircraft destroyed, sailors killed. But still they endured. Every damaged American carrier returned to service within weeks. Every lost pilot was replaced by another fully trained. Behind every vessel at sea stood an industrial nation determined to finish the war. Japan's remaining fleets, trapped in harbors with no fuel and no air cover, waited helplessly for the inevitable end. By 1945, U.S. carriers sailed unopposed off the shores of Japan itself. Fighter sweeps roared over Tokyo, naval bombers smashed industrial cities, and Japan's once proud navy could only watch from the pier, grounded, powerless. The empire that once mocked floating airstrips now faced a devastating truth. The aircraft carrier was the new master of the ocean. The era of battleships was over. The future of warfare was airborne, and Japan's miscalculation would cost them everything. The Pacific in 1945 bore no resemblance to the confident empire Japan envisioned in 1941. Carrier dominance, once their greatest advantage, had reversed into a chokehold around the homeland. The losses suffered at Midway and the Philippine Sea were not mere tactical defeats. They were the destruction of Japan's naval soul. The irreplaceable loss. Naval aviation is more than hardware. A carrier is only as dangerous as the pilots who fly from its deck. When 4 veteran carriers sank at Midway, the Imperial Navy lost its most experienced air crews. When hundreds of pilots died in 1944, Japan lost its future. Factories could produce aircraft, but no factory could reproduce experience. Rushed programs attempted to accelerate training, but war devours time faster than any curriculum can replace it. Young pilots entered combat barely qualified to fly, let alone survive against American veterans backed by radar, intelligence, and superior numbers. Japan's remaining carriers floated as empty shells. Flight decks with no aircraft. Hangars with no spare parts. Ready rooms with no seasoned leaders. A navy built around the idea of elite perfection had no answer to a war of attrition. The kamikaze turn. With aircrews depleted and industry strained by relentless bombing, Japan made a grim decision. Aircraft would be turned into human-guided missiles. The kamikaze strategy was born from desperation. Young men, some barely trained, were asked to sacrifice themselves to defend their homeland. Mothers were told their sons would become divine winds, echoing the storms that once saved Japan from Mongol invasions centuries before. These attacks struck fear into American sailors. A single plane could break through defenses. Ships burned violently when hit. The emotional shock was profound. Carriers took significant damage at Leyte Gulf and Okinawa. Decks erupted in fire, aircraft fuel igniting in terrible infernos. The cost in American lives was heavy, but the United States could absorb losses. Japan could not survive the cost of its own strategy. Each kamikaze was another pilot removed forever, another aircraft that could never return. Sacrifice replaced strategy. Heroism replaced hope. The carrier blockade. By mid-1945, American carrier task forces formed a moving wall around the Japanese islands. Fighter sweeps strafed airfields before aircraft could take off. Bombers destroyed railways, ports, and the last reserves of oil. Japan's navy was effectively locked inside its own harbors. Battleships lacked fuel to sail. Submarines were hunted the moment they surfaced. Carriers remained tied to docks, powerless. Even the colossal Yamato, once envisioned as the hammer of Japan's naval supremacy, was ordered on a one-way suicide mission toward Okinawa, with barely enough fuel to reach the battle. American air power ended the attempt before Yamato could fire a single shot. She exploded under waves of bombs and torpedoes, a spectacle of tragedy marking the final heartbreak of Japan's battleship faith. The ocean that once carried Japan to conquest now formed a prison of steel and horizon. Japan's leaders had underestimated not only the United States, but the pace at which warfare can evolve. They had won the revolution of carrier doctrine early, but failed to understand how quickly the next stage would follow. The sky, not the sea, now defined victory, and Japan had lost the sky. August 1945. The world that emerged from the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not the same world that watched Pearl Harbor burn. For Japan, defeat was not just military, it was ideological. The battleship dream died beneath flaming seas, and the Imperial Navy faded into history. But even in defeat, Japan's legacy would help shape a future it never intended. The U.S. Navy learns the lesson completely. The United States entered World War II with hesitation about carriers. It finished the war with absolute certainty. A battleship without air cover is simply a target. The numbers speak for themselves. Year U.S. Fleet carriers U.S. Escort carriers 194-171, 194-52871. This wasn't incremental change. This was a naval revolution completed in 4 years. Carrier task forces became floating airbases, fast strike groups, long-range scouts, defensive fighter shields, mobile platforms unrestricted by geography. They could hit anywhere, anytime. No runway needed. No permission required. The aircraft carrier wasn't just a weapon. It was global reach made real. Battleships face extinction. The giants of steel, Yamato, Musashi, Bismarck, Prince of Wales, Roma, one by one all proved the same truth. No armor can protect against the sky. Battleships still fired in Korea and even in Iraq decades later, but their role had changed. From kings of the sea to artillery platforms supporting troops. The era of naval duels at dawn was over. History doesn't always give farewells. Sometimes it gives new rulers. Japan's silent transition. Under occupation, Japan was stripped of offensive power. But the sea still surrounded them, and the lessons of the Pacific were impossible to forget. By the 1980s, Japan quietly rebuilt. Helicopter destroyers, anti-submarine fleets, advanced maritime technology. And today, Japan fields ships like the Izumo class, small carriers in everything but name, capable of operating F-35B stealth fighters. A quiet reminder, naval aviation, once their creation, still defines the oceans. The carrier age dominates the world. From the Cold War to today, one fact remains unchanged. Where a U.S. carrier sails, the world pays attention. Crisis in the Middle East, tension in the South China Sea, aggression in Eastern Europe, aircraft carriers go first. They are not just ships. They are moving geopolitics. A statement stronger than any treaty. We are here, and we control the air. The ghost of Midway. Every navy understands this now. Air power determines sea power. Sea power determines world power. And that principle was written in fire at Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, Midway, Leyte Gulf, Okinawa. Japan started the revolution. America finished it. The world never went back. The admirals in Tokyo once mocked the floating airstrips. They believed steel thickness and gun caliber would rule the future. History answered, the most powerful weapon on a ship is the airplane that can leave it. Carriers reshape wars. Carriers rewrite maps. Carriers decide empires. Japan learned it the hard way. America used it to shape the modern world. And to this day, 80 years later, the oceans still belong to the carriers. The age of battleships is gone. The age of the aircraft carrier endures. The Pacific today is peaceful. Waves roll softly over sunken steel, where the ghosts of battleships sleep beneath coral and sand. What once represented national pride and industrial might now rest silent. Monuments to a belief that firepower alone could command the sea. The aircraft carrier changed that forever. Innovation, not tradition, won the Pacific. Flight decks replaced heavy armor. Squadrons replaced salvos. Pilots, not gunners, became the decisive warriors of the ocean. Every navy learned the same lesson. The future belongs to those who can strike first, farther, and fastest. Yet history shows a quiet irony. Japan, the nation that first proved how carriers could cripple a fleet at anchor, would be the nation most changed by their power. Their early dominance ignited a new doctrine, one that America embraced with overwhelming speed and industry. By 1945, U.S. carriers didn't just win battles. They controlled destiny. And in doing so, they reshaped the world. Today, when tensions rise on any horizon, the same sight signals resolve. A flat, wide deck cutting through open water. Jets chained to steel, poised like arrows. A floating runway, sovereign wherever it sails. It is a promise and a warning, because the ocean remembers. It remembers battleships that once believed themselves invincible. It remembers carriers ignored as fragile airstrips. And it remembers the moment that belief collapsed under the roar of aircraft engines at Midway. Victory didn't belong to the biggest guns, but to the boldest idea. The Pacific was the proving ground. The aircraft carrier was the answer. And the world that followed still lives in the wake of that revelation. The age of battleships is history. The age of carriers continues, commanding the seas, shaping nations, and writing the future from a moving deck of steel.